is is actually a continuation on of some of these same sort of flavor of issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, I should really award you a certificate for putting up with me. Well, that too. But first, I need to give that to my wife. She deserves a trophy. Never mind, a trophy, a statue or something. So you merit a certificate not only for your willingness to tolerate this quadrant as a mixing matrix, but also the fact that you have now basically gone through materials on most of the key components of agent-based modeling in AnyLogic, and we're actually transitioning now out from topics which are sort of tend to be more specific to agent-based modeling to topics which cover all three approaches. So topics like calibration, topics like parameterization, topics like sensitivity analysis, topics like model debugging, performance issues. These carry across all the modeling types within AnyLogic. And I want to thank you for your patience in dealing with this large modeling vocabulary, this cacophony of state charts and events and parameters and variables and collections and transitions and all these different components that need to come together for you to build a breadth of models. Because we're transitioning now to a broader set of issues, things that carry across to all the modeling types, I thought we should discuss a little bit the different modeling types. And get some flavor for other things besides strictly agents that AnyLogic is capable of. To that end, I thought we would spend a little bit of time both sort of playing around with the software and discussing some of the implications, like why would you use one as opposed to others, okay? What I'd like to do is, the first thing I'd like to do is to reflect on the fact that we have, we've been using agent-based modeling, so we've seen quite a few agent-based models, so they're predominantly quite simple ones. You're seeing some more sophisticated ones in the guest lectures. I'd like to load in some models of other sorts here. So maybe what we'll start is, if we go to help, AnyLogic help, excuse me, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, close that. I meant to go to example models. Help example models in AnyLogic, okay? We should see this sort of splash screen with which you acquainted yourself in the very first sort of exposure to this class. And what I'd like to do is to go down, and I'm sort of ad-libbing this, but I'd like to scroll down on the right-hand side to the SIR case, okay? So you're scrolling down the examples here. I haven't touched anything on the left, and it's on the right-hand side, and I'm going to click SIR, okay? We've talked a lot about SIRs, perhaps more than most people are interested. And what I'm going to show you here is a different sort of SIR model. Does anyone notice something different about what's on the left-hand side here in the hierarchy compared to what we've already seen? Sorry? There's no person. There's no agents. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not an agent-based model. This is what can be known as a system dynamics model, a compartmental model, aggregate model. It's an aggregate model. We're counting the number of individuals in each of these states. I'll see if I can comment on that more in just a minute here. But fundamentally, we have a model where instead, so when we had agents, ladies and gentlemen, agent-based modeling, in this sort of modeling, you could think of them as almost transposes of one another, kind of flips of each other. With an agent-based model, our organizational principle for representing the population, ladies and gentlemen, is subdividing people according to their identity, according to individuals. So the structure of the population, the structure of the model captures distinctions between individuals, and each individual keeps track of their state, right? Keeps track of what their status is, for example. Keeps track of, with respect to an infection, keeps track of what their income is, keeps track of what their age is, all those sort of things. Does that make sense to people, right? We have individuals in the population, each keeping track of their internal state. By contrast, in this sort of aggregate model, what we have is the model is organized not according to individuals, it's organized according to state of the individual, or properties, characteristics of the individuals. Here, people are susceptible, or they're infectious, or they're recovering. And so we're dividing it according to state, and we're counting the number of people who fall into each category. We're counting the number of susceptibles. We're counting the number of infectious individuals. We're counting the number of recovered individuals. Now, you could look at this very, very hard, and you won't see any individuals here. What this model gives you is a series of cross-sectional depictions of the population over time. Very, very rich. You see the population over time in terms of number of individuals in each category. But it doesn't allow you to capture the life trajectory of particular individuals. Okay? So I'm gonna just ask for your imagination a little bit here. Imagine we had a waning of immunity. How would waning, so here we have a representation of susceptibles becoming infectious through this infection process. There's a flow of people, maybe 100 people per day in the height of the epidemic from susceptible to infectious. We have some flow of people from infectious to recovered occurring. Maybe it's 20 people a day rising up to 30, at the peak or what have you. If we wanted to capture a waning of immunity, people losing their immunity, say in this recovered phase, and again becoming susceptible, how would you represent that loss of immunity here? This is not a trick question.
Well, I think that I can answer that in the way it's
Yeah.
clear that I want to make a comment.
Sure.
The waning immunity is, from my medical knowledge,
Yep.
I see something that's missing. It's what the immunity
Okay.
is constant, susceptible to infection.
Okay.
I think in that sort of situation, I would say the waning immunity may be affected by the increased number of the reduction of you still have more people who are infected.
Okay.
I think because they are more protected, but I think what's, in my view, kind of missing from this is a state that is immune. You have a state that is susceptible, which is so you really get reached by different ways.
Mhm.
From the disease of the past,
Right.
so if you're talking about the concept of the immunity as some kind of state that is immune itself.
Okay. This recovered state, although it's called recovered, is meant to represent people who have been who are immune by virtue of natural exposure to the infection and recovery.
In developed countries, most people are immune by virtue of infection.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that would be
it
it.
depends on the disease.
Yeah.
I think it's, and that's why I sometimes feel like there's something missing.
Sure. Excellent point. And where would that be represented? For those who have seen this before, how would you represent vaccination typically? Bearing in mind that vaccine-induced immunity often is associated, for example, with higher waning rates or lower complete protection than natural exposure. Where would we represent vaccination? Exactly. There'd be a separate compartment called vaccinated, and you'd go there, and those people might eventually wane by having a flow back to susceptible, for example. And these people, common depiction would be a so-called SIRS model, susceptible, infected, recovered, susceptible. There'd be a flow back here. But the point that I'm wanting to make, and I don't want to diminish the significance of what Alexander was talking and Honky about, because that's very, very important. But the point I'm trying to make with these flows is, imagine if you had people coming back here. You might see infectious individuals, a certain number of people over time. In fact, you could see a graph up here, maybe it's this red component. That's a fraction that's infected. But we can't really ask in a model like this, who are these people here? Are these people here the same as the people that were here? Is it just sort of the same frequent flyers coming back and getting representing to the clinic? Maybe this is chlamydia and they're recovering after some period or they're becoming susceptible after some period of time. Maybe there's no persistent immunity and more or less immediately they become susceptible. Are these people the same as those people? Are they different? Well, you can't really ask that, articulate that in general in a model like this. This gives a set of cross-sectional depictions. It tells there are 100 people infected here, 100 people infected here, but we can't really say, is it the same people? How many? We can't easily ask, what fraction of the population has been infected more than 3 times, for example. Within a model like this, we can't really follow individual trajectories. But this does depict a cross-sectional depiction of the population. We have people classified in categories. Let's suppose that we wanted to distinguish, maybe this is an STI, we want to distinguish males and females. Maybe females have higher rates of asymptomatic infection, for example, as for gonorrhea. How would we do that? How would we capture males and females? Okay, so subscripts are, yes we can. AnyLogic supports subscripts. It supports what are called, in what sounds like a burst of marketing speak, hyperarrays, and dimensions that you can add to a model, so that there can be dimensions, for example, associated with sex. But conceptually what's going on is you've kind of duplicated this model for males and for females, and there's some interaction between the two. So males would be, having, assuming we're not talking about syphilis so much as say gonorrhea, maybe you'll see a lot of sort of cross-infection from the two. Here we have a different type of model. Let's run this model. Let's go run this. So this is in our main class. This is all in main. By the way, these constructs are built-in constructs to AnyLogic, so they're from the system dynamics palette. And as we'll see, it is most emphatically important you not think that these can live only in main. So you'll find quite a few models on your thumb drive, some of which are part of research projects where these things are depicting things at the level of an individual. So let's go run this model. How do we run this model? Ladies and gentlemen, this is still AnyLogic. How do we run it? The same way we did it before. This is AnyLogic. So I just want to emphasize we're dealing with the same general depiction. And here we see it swoop out, and in fact, you can go and click on some of these things and go draw the appropriate graph to see how that particular variable changed. Or this graph above is showing the number of susceptible, infectious, and recovered individuals, but it's not showing these flows. Number of people per unit time who are recovering, and you can do that with by clicking on it and clicking on this little thing that shows a graph up there. So here we can explore this model graphically. One of the key features of this model is it requires essentially no programming in a traditional sense. You click on one of these things, say this rate of flow. So I guess I should say here, I teach whole courses in this, and trying to pack it down into a few seconds is difficult, but what we have here is we have states. These are so-called state variables or stocks. They're accumulations that count the number of people at a given point in time who are susceptible, infectious, or recovered. And there, ladies and gentlemen, you specify for them their initial value, but other than that, they're entirely driven quantities by the values, say, number of infectious people at a given time is driven over time by number of people coming in and number of people leaving. It's kind of like a faucet with water coming in and draining out the bottom of the bathtub. And how the bathtub rises is purely dictated by the rates of water coming in versus the rates of water leaving. So the dynamics associated with infectious is dictated by these flows. What that means is, at an operational level, what you need to specify values or formulas for is the flow. So if you go click on this flow here, for example, and we go down to the Properties tab, what you'll find is that this flow here, come on, infection rate, okay. Oh, that's a link. Okay, yeah, okay, we'll explore it through this side. That's kind of a pain. Here's the infection rate here. So what we'll see is this is the formula for the infection rate. So we could, I could explain to you the theory behind this, but the idea is that each infectious person in the population is having contacts with, so imagine a given index infective, say, they're having contacts with contact rate, number of people per day, say it's 50 people, say it's 100 people per day. Some fraction of those people, of the people in the entire population are susceptible, maybe it's half are susceptible. So of those 100 people they contact in toto per day, half of them on average, or 50 people per day, will be susceptible. And for each of those susceptibles, you have a certain chance per contact of infection, this infectivity, commonly called beta within mathematical epidemiology. And that's what dictates this infection. But the point is that it's a formula you specify here. And similarly for the recovery rate, it's a formula as well. Generally speaking, you can have hybrid models where this is much more sophisticated, but here you have these formulas, and these formulas dictate the evolution of the stocks over time. So this particular model is stylized, but in general, we'll have more articulated models. This is a TB-related models where we have latent TB and tuberculosis, untreated active TB and active TB. This is a further depiction of it, which distinguishes between infectious versus non-infectious forms of active TB and individuals who have developed TB before because of differences in their representation rates and vaccination, BCG infected or vaccinated individuals given prophylactic treatment with what's called treatment for latent TB infection. And you have flows between all these things. This again is a compartmental model. It's a system dynamics model, and AnyLogic supports it very well. At other times, we may have those models operating conceptually at the level of an individual. For example, we may have within an individual some representation of their immune function. Here we have memory cytotoxic T lymphocytes and activated CD8 cells and clonally expanding CD8 cells, which can then help fight the infected cells and which in turn can lower the amount of free virus. The infected cells end up promoting free virus. So if we can lower the number of infected cells, we lower the free virions. So we can have these sort of models at an individual level or at a higher level. By contrast, we've been dealing with situations thus far where we have individuals and populations. Each of those individuals is in a set of different states. Okay. I'd like now to take a look at the third type of modeling. So this was the SIR model was with system dynamics, and we'll talk about some of the trade-offs. I'd like to talk about the third type of modeling. So if you go to help example models, and I think this one, yes, it's also, if you scroll down on the right, it's called Trauma Center. Okay, and the Trauma Center is going to depict what is unfortunately known unfortunately from my perspective, known as discrete event modeling. It's a confusing term because AnyLogic as a whole, and most emphatically the type of agent-based modeling we've been seeing is driven by discrete events. It's in continuous time. But this sort of discrete event model we're going to be seeing now is very process-centric. So let's run this model, go into simulation main, and we're going to see a glimpse of how this model behaves. So again, this is an AnyLogic model. You press this here. And what we're going to see here is a depiction of a facility, okay? And individuals come into this facility over time. There's a waiting room here. There's a registrar by which they register. They're taken by staff. So there's various types of healthcare workers here, including some nurses over here. You can see, for example, these nurses are distinguished by their color down here. Next to the nurses are doctors in a doctor's office, uncharacteristically crowded from my observation. And these individuals will go circulate, serve patients, take the patients for diagnostic procedures or for examination in a variety of rooms, and then eventually discharge patients. Patients are brought in via ambulance and walk-in here, and you'll notice that this is going on a minute-by-minute basis through the day. And if we speed it up, you'll find that these periods in early morning are very low use, but you'll find as the day progresses, there's greater flow coming in and greater use of these rooms. Okay, you'll find versions of the boot camp where I give sections on this sort of model, like teaching this sort of modeling, helping to understand it, but I want to highlight a few features of this right now. Traditionally, within this sort of modeling, you have, this sort of modeling is used for cases where you have sets of processes over time, and maybe to see this, we'll go click on the model logic here in the lower right. This would be an example of a process over time, which is depicting individuals as they come into the facility, and they're routed differently depending whether they're a walk-in patient or if they're an ambulance patient. And this is an indication if they are an ambulance patient, is triage required. If so, there's a set of processes that need to take place there. For a walk-in patient, they enter the walk-in area, they move into the triage room. There's a triage process. There's a room that's required for registration for them, and there's a set of subsequent processes, some of which are hierarchically described here, to capture the handling of patients. So you'll find whole additional flows in some of these categories. For example, for the emergency department. Individuals are flowing through here. Traditionally, these individuals are more passive. They flow through a set of processes that operate on them. They come into existence when they arrive. They disappear when they leave the system. And in the meantime, they're operated upon by a set of processes. And those processes typically require resources. So what sort of resources would be at issue in a situation like this, in a trauma center, or in a small set of hospital wards, including the emergency ward? What sort of resources are at issue? Okay, so people to help out with registration? Sorry? Nurses, that's right. Additional resources that might be needed? So those are human resources. How about some non-human resources? Space. Yeah, bed space. So reason to put a gurney itself maybe in some situations. Space for examination of patients, maybe certain types of diagnostic equipment, like a CAT scan or something. These are resources that might be required for handling particular patients, maybe an X-ray machine, perhaps an ECG machine for checking heart rate, etc. These are resources. There are limited numbers of them, and a lot of the weighting is because of waiting for these resources. So a key issue here has to do with queuing and delays in securing treatment as people, for example, flow through the system. And a model like this can further be spatially explicit. We saw that before with the animation. So we can capture sort of the impact of location of these resources. So where the nurse's room is relative to the entrance, or the location of the waiting area versus the registrar, or what have you, or the triage nurse. We can capture the impact of this by associating each of these resources and indeed the so-called entities themselves with some rates of speed at which they can move, etc. So we could ask what-if questions, for example, if we were to provide 2 rooms for nurses, one near the entrance and one larger room, further down, how would that speed up our handling of EMS patients from brought in by paramedics or an ambulance? Or we might ask something like, how might the location of a storeroom for certain types of bandages or certain types of splints affect their ability to process patients with certain types of traumatic injuries? And we can capture that within a model like this. We can capture impacts of layout, we can capture impacts of resource availability, amount of resources. We could capture impacts associated with changing the process. The processes here are typically fairly well defined for certain types. So if you're going to model it like this, for example, an emergency department, you might have a quite well-defined process of what's needed under different circumstances, different contingent circumstances, and you capture it within these flow descriptions, and then you could ask what-if questions if we had a different process in place. For example, how would that increase our throughput of patients, our ability to handle patients more quickly, our ability to render appropriate levels of care. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we call discrete event modeling, and it has its own subliterature, its own specialty journals, its own specialty conferences, and decades and decades of work in it as well. So each of these 3 types of modeling, agent-based modeling, system dynamics, discrete event modeling, have a lot of theory behind them. Many case studies done purely in those techniques. What's new here in the AnyLogic context is the ability to weave them together. Weave them together in a given project, but more notably, weave them together in a single model. So that portions of the model are done in one, portions of another. For example, you might have the infection spread within the population captured with a system dynamics model, but have individuals who are presenting for vaccination go through a set of processes as dictated by the discrete event model. Or you might have an agent-based representation of individuals in the population and their social networks, the social support, but have mental health services also represented in the discrete event model. Or you might have individuals whose immune system is modeled using a system dynamics model with stocks and flows, these sort of state variables changing over time, but they're enclosed in social networks and enclosed in physical spaces as described by an agent-based model. So agents with those embedded features. Yes, David?
How expensive will be in terms of the software to have, visual system dynamics and configuration in the window?
It's very expensive.
Because, in theory, one could simulate something like that. But
So it's expensive. I will say this, colleagues of mine in this very building will do simulations of coupled sets of differential equations, which is really what we're dealing with at mathematical level, where you routinely have hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, low millions of coupled differential equations interacting. They do it predominantly for biophysical simulations, things like electrical activation of the heart and the coupling of the electrical and the mechanical systems of the heart. In AnyLogic's case, there's no question that that it's very straightforward to build models. In fact, I give many examples that I've provided you, where individuals, for example, have dynamics described in part or in toto by system dynamics models. In fact, you can even have, through artful construction, you can have individuals whose equations governing them vary over time. So you might have an individual as a fetus governed by one set of different equations, an individual is born governed by a different set, an individual is an adult by a different set. You can do that very readily at a mechanical level. It's straightforward. There are performance implications, and you need to be very clear what you're trying to achieve, and you need to be clear about how the level of time granularity you need to simulate it with. So if you can have longer time steps, for example, with that model, it'll speed it up by leaps and bounds compared to if you require very, very fine time steps. So there's an art towards tuning it. And what I will say is this: do not assume that when you put this together, it'll automatically be tuned for your needs. You'll wanna think about, for your needs, what is that time granularity, and you wanna put that into a model. Straightforward to put it into a model, but you need to think about how fine do I need to simulate time. Because if you just use the default settings, it may be simulating things at a vastly more detailed level in the system dynamics than you need for your model, and as a result, it may go a lot slower than it needs for your model. Okay? So glad you talked about it, but there's no question also that if you have a model of 1 million people and you do it without any system dynamics components with any person, you do it with system dynamics components, it will go a lot slower with the system dynamics components. You pay something for it. Okay. And we'll come back to this in the performance discussion as well, about how to deal with that effectively, how to debug it, and those sort of things. Okay. So, yes. So very well spoken. So this whole question of how to use these approaches most effectively with each other is a fairly new topic, because it's only in recent years we've had the luxury of doing this. That's one reason. Second of all, sociologically, the people who are working with these sorts of models tend to circulate in somewhat different communities, and to have to enjoy certain cherished prejudices as to what sorts of models they'll use and not use, and honestly they have different skill sets associated with it. So we're really dealing in recent years only with a situation of starting to really engage with this issue of how do you most effectively use these techniques together, either within a project, in other words, as different techniques leveraged within the same project with different models from in isolation one another, but cross-fertilized, cross-checking each other, etc. And then how do we weave them together in a single model? And we're dealing here with a situation which is fairly core to our work, to kind of delineate when do we use one set of others. But it's also something you're seeing a lot of interest in the population, in the sort of population of modelers right now, particularly newer generation modelers who have the requisite generality of training to sort of appreciate and make use of all, say, 3 types of model. And the strategy that you've articulated is one of our key strategies. It's building simpler models at first, keep it simple at first, try looking for some leverage points where it's very sensitive, or points where it's really awkward, or where there are key uncertainties, maybe because it's so important to an intervention, or because characterizing at aggregate level it doesn't lend itself to aggregate description or what have you. And and on an exploratory basis, breaking those down, and modeling them in more detail. And this general approach holds even if you're only operating an agent-based model. I mean, with an agent-based model, you can put the kitchen sink in. Do not put the kitchen sink in, up front. You want to start simple, with fewer moving parts. You want to learn from it, and you want to expand where your experience suggests that it's most needed, where your appreciation for stakeholder interests, where your appreciation for where the data is, where your appreciation for sort of where the sensitivities are. That applies even with one technique, but especially with multiple techniques. So I think what you've articulated very well there is sort of one of the key principles. Use these things in a way that learns from your experience, that applies detail when it really seems to be required, rather than just kind of throw things in because you can. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll share this with you. So in addition to teaching modeling, I teach software engineering. And our university, like thousands of universities across the world, maybe tens of thousands, teaches, among other things, object-oriented programming, building of systems, and decomposing them into sort of chunks that maintain those state and properties and also their behavior. And we do a huge amount of this. And one of the key sort of problems that students run into is they realize how general this is, and if they're asked to build a system, a software system to do X, maybe it's a registration system for a university, because they can represent all sorts of things they do, and they throw everything into it often. It's not always, but this is one of the most common sort of problems that happens. Put all sorts of things in they don't need. And there's a term that came up for this in the software side, to sort of push back against people's tendency to do this. And the term is YAGNI. Does anyone know what that means? YAGNI? Y-A-G-N-I? You ain't gonna need it. So we could bet a lot of times back to, that'd be really interesting. Maybe we should have that in there, or give us flexibility in the future. We could do this and that. And it's good to reflect on what you're gonna have, but err on the side of not putting something in now, because as long as you can readily add it later, there's not a lot of benefit to putting it out, and you start getting bogged down and so on. So, when we're building software, there's sort of this countervailing push we try to pressure from the Agnew principle, so to keep our ambitions in line with what we need, we know we're going to need, and to add things in incrementally as the need becomes obvious, rather than adding them in at first. So some of these types of modeling are more detailed than others, and we can have recourse to them when we need them. I note that time is passing, and physiology being what it is, maybe we should pause for a little bit of a health break now, and we can continue on and talk about some of the texture trade-offs between these types of modeling. I do this because it was highlighted as one of the key questions that a lot of people coming to the boot camp have. What are these types of modeling? What are their trade-offs? And how can I use them together? So we're going to see if we can start to address those issues. Okay.